Meanwhile, Brian's also telling Drake all the same things. Your dad's a loser, man. He's standing in your way. You know, it's like you can't grow in this business when people don't like your management and all of this. People don't have their parents managing him. That's kind of weird, you know, like get yourself a professional. Your dad doesn't know. He's never been in Hollywood. I've been in Hollywood. I know how things work. I know everybody. Everybody knows me. I like everybody. Everyone likes me. I could get you places, but unfortunately, even I have limitations when your dad's hanging around being this giant wet blanket. After hearing this often enough, and after having both his mom and Brian, who are probably the two most pivotal other adults in his life, telling him, your dad's a problem, he starts believing, yeah, my dad's a problem. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're doing episode 3 of Quiet on the Set. This episode was all about Drake Bell. The entire episode is focused on his story because everything has been sort of leading up to this big bombshell moment. Prior to this documentary coming out, people did not know that the John Doe that had been described in the allegations against Brian Peck were talking about Drake Bell. And there were people in the documentary episodes before, people who had come up with Drake Bell, people who'd been around him, who did not even know that the person named in those allegations were Drake. To this very day, they didn't know it. This was where it had been revealed to them. So Drake has not been somebody who wants to be out there talking about his story. Even now, it pains him to discuss it. And there were parts of the story that he could not verbalize. And his physical discomfort at being in a position where he was having to talk about it was palpable. What was really interesting about his story, though, is that he had the worst story of anybody that we've heard yet, by far, by leaps and bounds. And like I said in previous episodes, I am not discounting people's bad experiences on the set of different Nickelodeon shows. I'm not discounting the fact that there was a lot of power dynamics at play and that people were constantly being put down or treated like they were stupid, or that the atmosphere was chaotic and you never quite knew what to expect from the grown-ups. They were often acting childish and kind of out of control. I understand that that kind of atmosphere would be very discombobulating. I'm not discounting people's experience on shows that mimicked Fear Factor, where people were being asked to do really gross and weird things. In my mind, when I look at things like that, I think, oh, it's this show that's having you do wild dares. In the comments, I got a lot of people who were saying, no, I think that was really wrong and evil, that they were basically torturing people for entertainment. And that's one way to look at it. I think with Fear Factor, there was a lot of people who were like, Fear Factor was a really gross and terrible show, and that was wrong that people were involved in that. I think that any adult that wants to put themselves in a situation in which they're being asked to eat bull testicles, that's pretty gross, although other cultures do eat them. So it's gross to us, but, you know, because if you're in another culture, it's not so gross. But there are a lot of scenarios on Fear Factor that are like, why are we climbing into a pit of snakes? You know, but those people wanted to do it. If you're so fame hungry that you're willing to lay down and have them dump spiders on you, okay. I mean, that's pretty sad for you that you'd be willing to do that. Some people were, but those were adults. So if we want to talk about the fact that kids shouldn't have been subjected to that, yeah, we can have a conversation about that for sure. A child doesn't have the same voice that an adult does. You know, a child's already just on the set of Nickelodeon, and then they say, okay, now we're going to do this. Did they even have the option to opt out of that programming? Probably not. And you also don't want to raise the alarm and cry about it, because then you won't be asked on. We saw that with a few scenarios where people complained even a little bit, and then it was like, goodbye, there's a whole string of other kids who want to be on the show. We'll get somebody who doesn't complain. So I understand the cost to some of these people to say anything. However, like I said last episode, all of these people's experiences, though bad and scary and stressful, none of them equate to what Drake Bell experienced. But what is interesting about his experience is, and it could just be that he had such terrible things going on in his private life that being on the set of Nickelodeon was like, ooh, peace, quiet. His experience with Dan Schneider was super positive. His experience on the shows were always positive. Like, he looked at everything he was asked to do as his fun adventure. Like, the way I think a lot of people who watch those Nickelodeon shows imagined it to be, that is his description of how it was. He loved all the sketch comedy. He loved the craziness of it. It was just fun. It was like laughing all the time. Whereas a lot of other people viewed that as power dynamics and adults making them do things they didn't want to do, and feeling like Dan Schneider was this evil presence that would show up on set and change the temperature of the room with his big personality and his demeaning way. Drake, probably because Dan liked him, never experienced the same situation that a lot of other people describe experiencing. So it's interesting because his time on the show is so different than what everybody else described. While at the same time, he has the worst story that anybody had connected to Nickelodeon. So that's really, I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition with their experiences versus his experiences. Oddly enough, Amanda Bynes says she declined to be interviewed for this documentary, saying, all these people's experience with Dan Schneider and all their time on the show does not reflect how I felt on the show. I did not have the experience these people had. So I don't know what happened to Amanda Bynes because she is categorically a train wreck now. Her demise was extreme. And it's really sad because I loved Amanda Bynes. I thought she was great. But something happened to her that created the current outcome. Drake Bell also had a great time in Nickelodeon, but there was personal things happening in his life that created a lot of chaos in his life, though he never experienced the whole Amanda Bynes, train wreck scenario. He definitely struggled with addiction, sobriety, all sorts of self-harming behaviors, not necessarily like hurting himself physically, but just doing things that were not in his best interest because he had so much self-hate after his experiences. Okay, let's go ahead and just talk about the story because I'm doing a lot of talking, but let's just discuss this. All right, so it starts out by talking about how ever since Drake Bell was itty-bitty, 5-year-old kid, he had been working in Hollywood. Now, his parents weren't from the industry. They didn't know anything about it. As he says, he and his dad, who did most of the work together, were just flying by the seat of their pants. His dad was his manager. His parents were divorced, but his mom was fine with him being in the industry. She liked the idea, and it was a real bonding experience for both Drake Bell and his dad. Drake would get out of school at 3:30 in the afternoon as he became school-aged, and then they would go out to auditions until 10 and 11 o'clock at night. But they loved it. Every day they did this. It was Groundhog Day for them. Go to school, go to auditions, go to sleep, do it again. And he had the stamina for it. He enjoyed it. He never felt put upon. He never felt stressed out about it. And probably because he and his dad did have such a good relationship. And he was getting commercials. As the 90s progressed, he was getting bit parts on different sitcoms. He was on Home Improvement. He was on Seinfeld. Then he gets on the movie Jerry Maguire. And so he's starting to get these parts. They're escalating more and more. The hope and dream was that one day he would get to be on a show and he'd actually be cast as a regular. Eventually that happened. They went for a casting call to Nickelodeon and he did his audition. And as he was leaving, Dan Schneider came out of the room and said, "Hey, you're on the show. Amanda Bynes wants you." So that was his ticket in, and he went on the Amanda Bynes show. And so that's how he became a Nickelodeon regular. Things were going really well. Like he said, great times. Didn't have any problem with Dan. Didn't have any problem with what they were asking him to do on set. Didn't think that he was being demeaned or belittled. To him, it was just the dream to finally get to be on a show and to be a regular and have steady work and to just keep building his skill set. Nickelodeon had been on the Paramount lot for a while, but then they moved over to Nickelodeon on Sunset. And Drake says, that the entire dynamics began to shift at that time. Because when they got to Nickelodeon on Sunset, that's when they hired Brian Peck. And Brian Peck immediately globbed on to Drake Bell. He saw in Drake a kid who he could have a lot of banter with. And Drake was really interested in Hollywood and the history of Hollywood. He was endlessly fascinated by all the old comedy duos. He loved I Love Lucy. He loved Abbott and Costello. He loved Charlie Chaplin, everything from way back old Hollywood. And Brian, having been in the industry for so long and also sharing similar interests, at least that's what he said. I think he did share similar interests, but it was definitely a bonding point for the two of them. Brian would tell him all these old stories that he had heard, things he had even experienced on his own with some of these people. And he was, at the time, he was in his mid to late 40s. So he had a lot of experience in Hollywood, dating way back to a time when Drake would never have known any of those people, but was very fascinated by the history. So that was a very easy point for them to connect on. And then, of course, Brian on set had a legitimate job. He wasn't just hanging around. He was the dialogue coach. And he would often have people coming to his house for lessons. That's where he said he did his lessons. So if you were using Brian as your dialogue coach, you would go to his house. So there just became this real normalcy about being very intimately involved with Brian over at his house, and then you're hanging out all day with him on set. And then Brian would also just have everyone over at his house all the time for parties and things. So it just became this thing where Brian was in every aspect of his life. As he began to get older, Drake also was part of a band, and his dad, being his manager, would book him for these various spots around California. Some of them were very far away. And Brian would always come to everything. And Drake says that this was odd because, Dan Schneider would come to his shows, but only if they were really close and it wasn't like really inconvenient for him to go. But Brian, with a pack of all of his friends, all the friends of his own age, it's like this whole crew, would always show up wherever he was. And it was this constant familiarity with Drake when he didn't need to be hanging around Drake that really began to concern Drake's dad. Like, why was this guy always hanging around when he could be doing something else? If they were on set, he would always find himself in Drake's dressing room. He would always be helping Drake put something on when Drake could totally have done it by himself. If they were running lines, he would find some reason to touch Drake's shoulder, run his hand down Drake's arm, put his arm around his waist as they're like looking over lines together. And this really concerned Drake's dad, as it should. It should have concerned any parent. And he started to agitate a little bit with production about why in the world was this guy so familiar with his son. He didn't like it, and he really wanted Drake and Brian to have a little bit more of a professional relationship. He really wanted some distance created there. When he brought this up to production, they said, well, don't you know that Brian Peck is gay? And maybe you're just a little homophobic. Brian's a touchy-feely guy, and your concerns have really more to do with you and your phobias and your hatred for other people than it has to do with Brian. So maybe you should check yourself. And it was this concern and the voicing of this concern that caused Drake's dad to become ostracized. But before that even had started, Drake's dad had always been involved with whatever Drake was doing. Now, he was never interrupting production. He was never being loud, noisy, saying anything. But when all the other parents were hanging out in the green room, he made sure to keep eyes on his son. Because he says, people talked about how you had to watch your kid in this industry. It wasn't like a secret where nobody had ever heard of anybody hurting any kids. He said the scuttlebutt was watch your kid on set. So he did. And not being part of this industry, he hadn't developed any kind of ease with it. He didn't take it for granted that his kid would be fine. And so he always made sure that he had eyes on his son. And that's why he was able to pick up on the fact that this weirdo, this guy in his 40s, is constantly hanging around his son and finding reasons to touch his son. But voicing that was a mistake. He also wasn't shy about talking to Brian about, you need to back up off my kid. You need to give Drake some space. He can put those clothes on himself. You need to be all up on him while you're running lines. And Brian immediately decided that the person he needed to get out of the way was Drake's dad. He has zeroed in on Drake, and he's going to get Drake. And if his dad's in the way, then get the dad out of the way. And it was a really easy way to do this. Drake's parents had a very contentious divorce and didn't get along with each other. And so while Drake spent the majority of his time with his dad being his manager, his mom also wasn't out of his life. So Brian begins to feed the mother this whole story about how, Drake's got it. He's a really talented kid, but you've got this really difficult manager in your ex-husband. He just constantly keeps getting involved. He constantly keeps bothering people, and he's just going to stand in the way of Drake. Parents really shouldn't be managing their kids. They're just too emotionally involved, and it's just because Drake's dad is such a difficult person to get along with, it's just going to be really hard for Drake because he's got this guy who's attached to him. People just don't like him. Sorry to say, they don't really like him. Drake's dad wasn't any of those things, but that's what Brian said to Drake's mom. And because Drake's mom already didn't like the guy, it's like, yeah, you're probably right. People probably don't like him. I don't like him. And so they began agitating that for Drake's dad to step out. Meanwhile, Brian's also telling Drake all the same things. Your dad's a loser, man. He's standing in your way. It's like you can't grow in this business when people don't like your management and all of this. People don't have their parents managing him. That's kind of weird, get yourself a professional. Your dad doesn't know. He's never been in Hollywood. I've been in Hollywood. I know how things work. I know everybody. Everybody knows me. I like everybody. Everyone likes me. I could get you places, but unfortunately, even I have limitations when your dad's hanging around being this giant wet blanket. Drake being like 13, 14, 15. He doesn't know. All he knows is that Brian really does have connections in the industry. Like, no joke, Brian's not lying about that. He's very well connected. And he's been doing this for a long time. And Drake starts thinking, yeah, maybe my dad kind of is a little bit of a nuisance. Drake's dad has big feelings about things, and he's not afraid to say how he feels, and he can be emotional. And so I think that Drake probably was easily convinced that his dad was a little bit of a loose cannon and probably should be ostracized from his career, or he should find a different path or just do something else. After hearing this often enough, and after having both his mom and Brian, who are probably the two most pivotal other adults in his life, telling him, your dad's a problem, he starts believing, yeah, my dad's a problem, and he just wants his career to keep growing. He's doing really well at Nickelodeon. He's also doing really well with his band. So he's not looking for anything to get in the way of that. And if people are saying his dad is, it's like, all right, fine, let's cut him out. Finally, after spending a week at his mom's house, they decide, let's stop talking about getting your dad out. Let's get your dad out. So his mom calls his dad and says, Drake's done with this. He doesn't want you to be his manager anymore, so just butt out. His dad is devastated. But at the same time, his dad also thinks maybe they're right, this isn't what I want, but this is clearly what Drake wants. I'm not trying to stand in the way of his career. So he gives all the financial documents, everything over to his mom. He says, if you think that you can do better with this or you can find somebody better to do it, I'll give it. If it's my personality that's causing the problem, then you handle his career. So he steps back. And not only does he step back from the managing situation, but because Drake's getting older, there's not as much time for him to spend with his dad. The time they were spending together was during that whole managerial period when his dad would be driving him everywhere. And now without that, it is so easy for Brian to just slip right in, take a seat, and say, I'm your dad now, basically. But what cannot be skipped in this story is the fact that Drake's dad said to Drake's mom, do not let our son near Brian for any reason. That guy is a predator. Don't let him be alone with him. Don't let him spend too much time with him. That guy is constantly hanging around our son. There's something weird about that guy. Don't let it happen. He said this to her face, not in a phone call, not, in a letter, but to her face to let her know, I'm very serious about this. But the problem is, you can say that, but if your ex-wife already hates you and she already thinks this Brian guy is perfectly fine, because Brian was amazing at making people think he was perfectly fine, how much are you really going to pay attention? You're just going to be like, oh, you've been ousted because of your bad attitude. So don't come to me and tell me that Brian's terrible. Enough already. So the mom did not take that warning seriously at all. And the mom was the worst person to manage Drake because she doesn't want to be involved. She doesn't want to drive him to auditions. She doesn't want to. They live an hour away from all of this. And so Brian, knowing exactly what he was up to because he is a master manipulator, tells Drake, oh, it's okay if your mom doesn't want to drive you down here. Look, I'll take you to your auditions. I'll do it. It's totally fine. I'm more than happy to do it. I'll come pick you up. But those auditions, they go pretty late. So why don't you just crash on my couch and I'll bring you home the next day. So this becomes his cycle where he's going to auditions or working late. And his mom, who doesn't like to drive and definitely doesn't want to drive an hour to LA, decides that this seems like a fine arrangement. She totally trusted Brian. Like, if there was ever a person who Brian had pulled the wool over her eyes, it was Drake's mom. Brian always wanted to do fun stuff with Drake as well, take him to Disneyland. Brian was super supportive of Drake's music career, always coming with all of his friends. No matter where Drake went, even if it was hours away, Brian would show up. And at the time, Drake says that he just looked at it as, oh, my friends are here. Because working at Nickelodeon, his friends were friends of all ages. All the cast and crew spent all day together. There wasn't necessarily this feeling for him that age delineated friendships, that these are my friends and then those are the grown-ups. Everybody was together all the time. So his alarm bells weren't going off the way they should have gone off. Because all day long, he was talking to the grown-ups almost as though they were his equals. So what was it to him if Brian showed up? Feeling like he was safe with Brian, it never occurred to him that he should distance himself. Up until this very point in the story I'm about to tell you about, there weren't for him red flags the way there had been for his dad. But one night, he's spending the night at Brian's house. He's on the couch. And when he woke up, he found Brian with him, and Brian was absolutely taking advantage of him. And he didn't know what to do. He didn't have a car. He hadn't driven there himself. And what's he going to do? Get on the phone and be like, hey, Mom, this just happened. Brian just did this to me. Can you come pick me up? I'll just sit on the couch and wait for an hour with this predator while I wait for you to come get me. Like, he didn't know what to do. He was 15 at the time. So he didn't say anything. And it just became this secret. And Brian, of course, was really apologetic about it. Like, sorry, man, I didn't mean to do that. It's just like, it just happened, But it's like, don't be scared. Don't be worried. I totally crossed the line, but it's never going to happen again. It happened again and again and again and again and again and again. And it got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And Drake, it's so sad. He cannot talk about it. And we don't need to hear all of it. We don't. I mean, it would not edify even one of us to know about the details. But he says he's trying to figure out a way to talk about it as he discusses how terrible things were getting and how the abuse was escalating. And he's shifting in his seat and he's so uncomfortable. And he says, I don't know how to talk about this on camera. And he keeps trying to find his words and he can't. And she says to him, the interviewer says to him, well, whatever you're comfortable with. And he says, and you can see he's agitated, not at her, but just there's an anger to what he says because the situation is so wrong. And he says, why don't you do this? Why don't you think about the worst thing somebody could do to somebody else in a sexual assault? And there's your answer.
Elaborate on that on camera, really.
Whatever you feel comfortable or you think will help.
Why don't you do this?
Yeah.
Why don't you think of the worst stuff that someone can do to somebody as a sexual assault, and that'll answer your question.
The camera doesn't cut away from him after that either. He's still shifting in his seat, trying to figure out what he's supposed to do with this information and what we're supposed to do with this information, And so he says that these secrets were plaguing him, but he couldn't tell anybody, I don't want to go to Brian's house anymore. Because if he says, I don't want to go to Brian's house anymore, well, what then? Now all the adults are going to start asking more questions. Well, why don't you want to go to Brian's house anymore? You guys are really good friends. Wait, what happened? And he doesn't know how to say what happened. And so Brian's just relentlessly abusing him in all the worst possible ways you could abuse someone. Eventually, Drake gets a girlfriend. Thank God, there's somebody else's house to go to where no one's going to question why he wants to hang out there all the time. So he starts hanging out at the girlfriend's house, and he says that the girlfriend's mom picked up in 6 seconds what was going on. So one day, he is at the girlfriend's house. There had been plans to go to Disneyland with Brian. They did that a lot. That was something that they enjoyed doing. But now that he's with his girlfriend, he doesn't want to go over there. And thank God he has a reason now not to go. And so Brian starts calling his cell phone, but he doesn't pick up because he knows what it is. He knows Brian's like, hey, where are you? We're here. You're going to come, right? No. So he doesn't pick up. Brian's blowing his phone up. Where are, ring, ring, ring. It's just like going on and on and on. Then he leaves off the cell phone, starts calling the girlfriend's house relentlessly. The phone is like ringing off the hook. Well, this is embarrassing. So Drake picks up the phone and tells him, hey, I know I said I was coming. I've I've double booked. And I'm just going to hang out here, but you guys have fun. Brian does not take that well. He rips into Drake and is so angry, super mad. So Drake just hangs up. Like, what? Is he going to keep having that conversation? So then the house phone continues to ring off the hook some more. Finally, Drake's girlfriend's mom says, Drake, can I talk to you in the kitchen for a minute? And he goes, he talks to her, and she says, what's the deal with this? What's going on? Are you okay? Drake's like, yeah, I mean, he just wanted to go to Disney World. It's okay. He's just a little bit weird sometimes. And Drake's mom's like, no. A guy in his 40s does not call my daughter's boyfriend over and over and over and over and over. And that is supposed to be called normal. That is insane behavior. And she says, are you okay? Is there something happening? And he does not articulate to this woman what's happening. But he does say, yeah, I mean, it's just kind of awkward. He's getting a little weird. So it's just kind of hard. I don't really want to spend as much time with him as I used to. Trying to figure out a way how to not spend as much time with him, but he just isn't taking it very well. So this really scares the girlfriend's mom. So she calls Drake's mom and says, I'm taking Drake to our family therapist tomorrow. Something is happening. He needs to talk about it. So they take him to the therapist the next day. But unfortunately, he isn't able to verbalize what's happened. He doesn't know how to talk to this strange therapist about it. And he doesn't know even how to talk about it. And as he says in the documentary, he's like, I don't even to this day know how to talk about it. I've only talked about this in therapy as an adult, but I still don't know how to verbalize what happened to me. So I certainly didn't have the tools at the age of 15. So he just goes right back into the life he's been leading. Meanwhile, he is now on a spin-off show where it's this buddy comedy and he and this other Nickelodeon character are playing these brothers. It hasn't been shot yet. They shot the pilot, but it had to be reshot. And this whole time, Brian has been in Drake's ear being like, hey, tell Dan that I should be the dad on that show. Tell Dan, let's see if I can get to be the dad on the show. Wouldn't that be great? We could work together all the time. Drake's like, hell no, that wouldn't be okay. And he keeps telling Brian, no, come on, no, just don't. It's not your thing. And finally, he just starts getting agitated. And I think just being able to have an adult pick up on the fact that something wasn't okay kind of broke the dam. Like, he didn't verbalize to the therapist what had happened. He didn't tell his girlfriend's mom what had happened. But having somebody pick up on something isn't right here stirred up in him this ability to say something. Because he says these secrets were so intense and he thought that nobody could see that something was going on, because certainly no one was acting like they could figure out something was going on, that he just felt like this was something he was going to have to live with. And he didn't know how. But to have another adult say, something's not right, I don't know what it is, but something's wrong, galvanized him. And he says he doesn't know what happened the day that he decided to tell his mom. He said he was on the phone with her, and then the dam broke. And he was just screaming down the phone line everything that had happened to him with Brian. His mom immediately calls the police and gets him to the house. The police come and interview him at the dining room table, and he's laying out everything that happened in gruesome detail, because the police aren't the therapist. They're not going to sit around and wait for you to find the words. And then they've got to get Brian to admit it. So they have Drake call Brian, and they are taping the whole conversation. And Drake gets Brian to admit to everything that he's done by saying, hey, I know you said you'd never let this stuff happen again, but I'm really struggling with it now. Why did you do those things to me? Why? And so they start cataloging all the things that Brian did. You know, Drake's like, well, why did you do this to me? And why did you do this to me? And Brian's not denying it, but he does feel scared that the call is being recorded, and must have said dozens of times, is this being recorded? Is this being recorded? Or, you know, of course it was being recorded, but Drake managed to get a confession out of Brian. And so the episode ends with Brian being convicted, though not, the sentencing is in the next episode. But what is so shocking about the very end of this story, and definitely on into the next story, we'll really get into this in major detail, is the fact that Brian was well connected in Hollywood. And he ran the gamut of all of his friends, and he said, I have been falsely accused. Please come and support me. this child is saying all these terrible things about me. I didn't do any of those things. He's just making it up. Please support me. Write letters of support to the judges. Please be there with me on the sentencing day. I can't believe that my reputation is being maligned like this. You know me. You know I wouldn't do any of these things. It's completely against my character. And all of these people who had not ever been at the hands of Brian Peck believed that he really was being falsely accused. They say they believed it. And we will definitely dig into this next episode. But just as a sort of preview of that, one of the things that I find so shocking about these letters of support are how many times adults said in their letters of support, Brian didn't do this, but if he did, it's because somebody tempted him beyond anything he could experience. So he fell to temptation. That sentiment or sentence is repeated over and over and over and over and over in scores of letters. What kind of a logic is that to say, oh, well, if Brian did hurt this 14-year-old kid, it's because the 14-year-old kid tempted him beyond something he could handle, so he gave in. You're going to blame the 14-year-old kid? Are you kidding me? And all of these adults in Hollywood did. What I think is reprehensible is the fact that all of these people who stood behind Brian Peck, who voiced their support for him, either written support or verbal support, or were physically in the courtroom during sentencing. All of these people have refrained from coming to Drake and saying, I am sorry that I didn't believe you. I am sorry that you had to sit in the courtroom with no one but your mom and your brother while the other half of the courtroom was full of people who supported a child predator. There are people who have come out and been like, oh yeah, I wrote a letter, but I didn't really realize what Brian had done. There are people who have gone on podcasts and said, yeah, if we'd known, we never would have been in there supporting him. We just had no idea. Or we were listening to the testimony in court and then we realized we had supported a monster, but we didn't know it before then. But not one of those people have come out and tried to reach out to Drake Bell and say, hey, I am really sorry that at the pinnacle of your pain, you had no friends by you. Not one of those people have come out and said anything to him. And they could find him. It's not like one of us being like, well, how would I reach out to Drake Bell? They're all running in the same circles. Hollywood is a twisted place. And so the way I'll end this is by saying, if ever a person has a intuition that somebody else is a frightening, scary, or evil person, follow that intuition. There's no reason to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Trust but verify, my friends. And Drake's dad never, ever, ever would have allowed this to happen to Drake had he been the one at the helm. He trusted his intuition. And because he was forced out by a lot of other people who would rather have fame, money, and glory, then Drake was molested at the hands of somebody who his dad had pinpointed as the problem. The real sad part of this story is that when Brian was convicted, Drake called his dad and said, hey, did you hear they got him? And his dad said, what are you talking about? He said, they got Brian. Brian has been convicted. He's a predator. And his dad said, I am so grateful that he never got his hands on you. And Drake didn't tell his dad at that time that actually he's been convicted because of me. Because his dad was a very emotional person, and Drake at the moment couldn't handle his dad's pain at hearing that news, so he didn't say it. The dad obviously knows now, shortly later, obviously during sentencing and everything, it came to light that Drake was the John Doe. And his dad's pain talking about it is so visceral. I mean, he wept, as any of us would if this was our son, and just said the pain that he felt on hearing the news that his son had been so terribly, terribly abused is still with him to this day. He'll never get over the pain that he felt on hearing that. And especially when he had taken such pains to make sure that didn't happen to his kid. To then find out that it not only happened, but it happened at the worst scale that has ever been reported would have been news that you could hardly handle. Anyway, that is the end of that episode. But next episode, we're going to talk about the sentencing, the support that Hollywood gave to the predator, and talk about just what did Nickelodeon do after that, and the trajectory of Nickelodeon after all of this happened, and whatever happened to Brian Peck. You know, we know that PA got like 16 years in jail, but what does Brian Peck get? What is his sentencing like? And what kind of life did he go on to lead after he got out of prison? And what was the reception of this news? You know, what was the reception of the news that this major person in Hollywood who had all these connections to all of these kids shows and beyond, how did they receive it? It's a pretty devastating episode, honestly. It's because this is like, are you kidding me? For real? But it's also very enlightening. All right, thank you so much for hanging out with me. Again, if you are enjoying the Mountbatten book, I have not abandoned that project whatsoever. I'm just trying to put out a little bit more relevant content. So another episode for that coming out either today or tomorrow. And just expect to see a little bit more some of these different shows. But of course, I will always read books. I'm just looking to bring some more content that maybe is more relevant to what we're doing today if people don't enjoy the historic biographies the way we do. All right, I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.